introducing Stas Menzelevskyi. Stas is a film scholar, archivist, and co-founder of the Medusa Publishing Project. He headed the research and programming department of the Alexander Dovzhenko National Center for over a decade. He is the co-author of Atomopolis, Assembling Utopia, and Lviv Intervision compilation films. Currently, he's pursuing a Ph.D. at the Media School after spending time as a Fulbright Fellow at UC Berkeley and as a Carnegie Fellow at Columbia University's Harriman Institute.
Thanks. Oh, come on. Thank you for being here. Despite this epic introduction, I'm it's not uncomfortable. I'm not uncomfortable, but I'm far beyond my kind of comfort zone, because before coming to IU, my area of interest was mainly Soviet avant-garde films of the 20s and silent films. And now I kind of presented something which I started to develop recently, like maybe 2021 to be precise, when I came here. Yeah, so be strong, be patient, and together we'll survive my talk. This talk is
There you go.
yeah. There's a part of my dissertation project, which is called Chernobyl Cinema, Audio Technology and Film in Soviet Ukraine. 4 chapters. I will talk about the first chapter, which I started to write this semester. So, and it's called Documenting Utopia, Ukrainian atomic towns before Chernobyl. And by Chernobyl, I mean explosion of the 4th reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986. So I will give you a brief context of kind of Soviet peaceful atomic projects, and I will describe my goals and ambitions, and I will highlight one kind of key studies or like one example working right now. So yeah, so the most ambitious manifestation of the Soviet peaceful atomic project was the establishment of all-union network of nuclear power plants, which should mark the transition from steam age, which is 19th century, to kind of atomic age, which was 20th century. So I frame it, or kind of see this project as a part of Cold War technopolitics, and the definition of technopolitics I use. And by Cold War, I mean in my project ideological and technological competition in kind of several modernization projects after the Second World War. So technology was very important to promote kind of socialism or communism in the future iteration for post-colonial countries, and just like for post-Second World War geopolitical situation, in the geopolitical situation. So the first nuclear power plant was built in Obninsk near Moscow. It's called Obninsk Nuclear Power Plant, 1954, first in the world. Together with Sputnik satellite, launched in 1957, like became the main tool of Soviet kind of technological pride and ideological superiority combined. This project of construction of nuclear power plants was also nonlinear and contradictory. Despite kind of image of Soviet society as totalitarian in a way, it lacked totality, strategic planning, any administrative uniformity. So the program, in the program, this program involves so many agencies with overlapping kind of with different degree of autonomies and overlapping functions, different committees, subcommittees, 2 main ministries, Ministry of medium machine building, which was called, but it was ministry in charge of producing Soviet nuclear bomb, atomic bomb, and energy of electrification. And there are different scientists pursuing different political individual goals and political goals as well. And we can also add dynamic of Soviet republics, which Soviet Union consisted of 15 Soviet republics, is very different agendas they're pursuing. So in recent scholarship, this project more or less often described as colonial and Russo-centered, or like centered around Moscow and Russian Federation of Soviet Republic, among Soviet republics. And there are several reasons for that. Like, and you can see the map of like Soviet Union, Russian Federation, Ukraine, Lithuania, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. So first two non-Russian nuclear power plants were established to build in Armenia one, and the second one is Chernobyl in Ukraine, almost 20 years after the kind of first nuclear power plant was built in Obninsk. So for more than 22 decades, it was very Russian-centric or Russo-centric in a way. Then we can also mention extractionist policy of the Soviet Union. So you need uranium to kind of operate nuclear power plants. Immediately after the Second World War, they used deposits in Slovakia and Eastern Germany, kind of mine uranium. And this extractionist policy was also kind of extrapolated on all other republics. In Ukraine, near Zaporizhia, the main uranium mines, which were like developed and established in late 40s. And we can also mention nuclear testing or bomb testing in Central Asia. Kazakhstan suffered a lot, and there is like a recent scholarship called Atomic Steps about explosions in Kazakhstan. So following kind of the example of other nuclear state, Soviet Union became nuclear because of its kind of imperial and colonial legacy. And resources were distributed in very unequal ways. There's an example that after the Second World War, 60% of not atomic and nuclear power, but hydropower electricity produced by hydropower projects, 60% of it were designated for use in Moscow and the region. 60% of the whole Soviet Union, which is quite huge. And I also want to I'm trying to highlight the strategic role of Ukraine in the Soviet atomic project. Ukraine had borders with Eastern Bloc. It was easy to transfer electricity from Western Ukraine to Poland, for example, or Romania. Ukraine had a lot of kind of water sources, rivers, like Dnipro River is the main river. So if you see like the rivers here, and you can see all nuclear power plants are built at it. And here's another South Buk River. So Ukraine had a lot of water resources, and water is needed to cool the reactor during operation. Established research tradition. So there are like several institutes responsible for kind of nuclear physics research. One is in Kharkiv, was behind kind of the fundamental design of the atomic bomb, for example. And I mentioned uranium mines before. So by 1990, like 20 years after Chernobyl nuclear power plant started, constructions of Chernobyl nuclear power plant started. It was envisioned then 9 nuclear power plants in Ukraine were like envisioned to produce about 40% of all electricity in the republic, in the Ukrainian. So it's social Soviet Republic, and like so in gray it's like unfinished project and the projects that were finished and built. And while Atomograds, which means basically atomic towns, were promoted across Soviet culture as a harmonious spaces where like nature, technology, and humans coexist. And then red is like Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is currently shut down and occupied by Russian forces. So my research is basically film scholarship about these 4 films produced by Ukrainian Studio of Television Films from 1974 to 1982. It was unprecedented in terms in like Soviet framework. There are no films produced about atomic nuclear power plants construction and atomic town in other Soviet republics on that scale. So what I'm trying to do here, and there's like research question. I'm interested in how this atomic towns represented and nuclear power plants represented in this nonfiction films. Nonfiction film is a more scientific way to say documentary film. And how did this film contribute to Soviet-Ukrainian discourse on nuclear energy and like technology and modernity in general? Now I'm primarily interested in representation of labor in this film, labor, collective work, and like non-alienated labor is a cornerstone of socialist modernity. So I'm also interested in the community, environmental perspective, how they try to reconcile nuclear power plant as a technology and nature and environment. Chernobyl is built about like 60 miles north from Kiev, so it's kind of pretty dangerous spot. How does they try? All this film address the social contradictions and issues, and that's basically like what of research question I have, and my kind of overarching argument. I'm working with film basically. So this documentary film about atomic towns create in a utopian mode, one that enables them to reframe the political and social contradictions of late socialism as already transcended, or they kind of perform or screen or should frame problems as their own solutions in a very kind of paradoxical in a way, but very propagandistic way. And I use the idea of utopia in a very narrow sense. As it was published by film scholar Richard Dyer in 1977, he analyzed American musical films. And his argument and entertainment industry works because it's kind of creates this, gives us like solutions for social contradictions. He created this very kind of dichotomy of utopian solution on social contradiction. So he moves away from like utopia as being idealistic, non-grounded in reality type of concern into very materialistic and social idea of utopia. And for him, it's quite important that utopia, it's very important for film scholarship, that utopia is contained in the feelings. And utopia is important the way it feels than how it would be organized. So it's a very different idea of describe utopia analytically. Or if you can say just like Soviet Union is the best country in the world, producing the safest energy in the world, and we will have like abundance of resources because of nuclear power plant construction. And it's very different from when you're making a film about kind of Soviet Union being that kind of the road, and the rest completely different and communicate completely different emotions in a very different way, using montage, like editing, color, sound, music works different. And that's why I think it's very interesting to kind of apply this approach to Soviet films. That kind of complicates the simple idea of propaganda films. It works, but why does it work and how it works? So just to give you a sense or feel of this utopia, very short clip from one of the film, and I will move forward to like issues of labor in the film. So that's way to illustrate how different it is to describe utopia or see or live, kind of emulate this utopian experience through cinematic medium. What else? Okay, I'll move here. So these films, there's works in this utopia on a very several different levels, which I kind of try to analyze in my project. So there are like scientific utopia, energy utopia, which is important, abundance of resources, which means electricity and heat at some point. Ideological utopia as being techno kind of political projects, it immediately means that communism is a better way to operate technology, to organize research than in other countries. Labor, I will talk about labor now, like work as leisure. Social, creating a community and more just like a composition of different people, but just like a family, Soviet family, and people who like pursuing one goal, moving forward, the bright future. Ecological is very important. I'm not kind of developed this idea yet. So how to reconcile presence of nuclear power plant in the environment? It's a Polissa region, north from Kiev, like a lot of forest, rivers, very kind of diverse ecological system. So just like in one way, so there is a pond next to Chernobyl power plant. Just like one way, how do they do it? To kind of cool the reactor. And the narrative repeating over and over again, then you can use this pond to kind of to have fish there and fish. And so that's how you kind of try to reconcile the nature and nuclear power plant. And Urban, the Perfect Town project is also very important and kind of address the different visions of Soviet kind of Union towards urban planning starting from 1920s and 30s. And there are different towns that were designed to be like isolated, community-focused places. So there were also scientific towns in Siberia, for example, that they put all scientists together to kind of create this vibrant community and kind of move Soviet science forward. There are also closed towns with it connected and linked to military industrial complexes that produced like military kind of application of nuclear project. And there are also very important projects of green towns in the late 30s when they kind of try to manage the post-revolutionary ruin. There was two approaches to urban planning. Should we create like huge towns, like megapolises type of towns, like New York, for example? Or should we create small connected community, like networks of community along the roads? And it was a very efficient way. So at Chernobyl, like Pripyat is the name of Chernobyl atomic town, was also envisioned in a way to create a like close, sustainable community of kind of single-minded people who enjoy their life and working process in a way. So yeah, I will briefly, because we don't have much time, describe the issues of labor in the how they represent labor in the field. So Chernobyl nuclear power plant construction, as many other like large-scale projects in the Soviet Union, was declared a Komsomol construction site. And Komsomol is a communist union fuse. It's like a young people affiliated with Communist Party. The majority of like construction workers at Chernobyl nuclear power plant and atomic town were like Komsomol members. What are the kind of parameters of this Komsomol workers? So they're usually temporary workers. They were like being paid less than kind of average worker. Sometimes they worked for free. I mean, they worked for food, work, and housing, which is very interesting dynamic. But like labor compensation and the way the film and kind of official propaganda discourse frame it, so they've worked and they construct like nuclear power plants just because they're patriotic duty or like civil ideological service. So you work for free, but and how the film frame it in a very specific term. So it's a like confession of a worker why he came to work, because it's like he works for the basis for the future human happiness, which is like bizarre when you're not being paid for your work. So they created the sense of belonging to the broader project and broader and brighter future, which is like, of course, construction of communities. So they construct houses, but they not also construct houses, they create a community and contribute to like communism development. So the official propaganda responds to this like social contradiction of unpaid human labor.
Can I ask you a clarifying question
Yes.
very quickly? So these laborers weren't paid, but others were, so, or this specifically, or you mean as a whole, that argument?
Komsomol members weren't paid. I mean, they were paid sometimes they weren't. It was like very no straight like policy.
Any reference on that? Because I've never heard about such a thing. I mean, I've seen plenty of writing from that period, so I understand, like, say, at least in Russia, like, okay, they would have those young Komsomol teams going to Siberia to build new maybe railways, oil fields, whatever. But usually the expectation was they would be paid more than somebody staying in a city in European Russia. That was the real incentive. Of course.
Maybe, I mean, in case of Chernobyl, it's different. I don't know.
But like any
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
the literature of the period, or reference to this in a maybe mentioned in actual movie or
I mean, they don't mention payment in movies at all,
okay, but
because the idea is to kind of avoid they not bring in payments at all, because it's a social contradiction they want to avoid.
but I mean, they had the labor codes, they had standard wage rates. I mean, this piece of information that some of those young
We will
Komsomol.
have time for the discussion. No, it's just that, that was a clarifying one. I didn't understand if you were referring to these specific workers. But we will
Yeah,
have time for the discussion, yeah.
It wasn't like completely free labor. That's what I was saying. They were paying less I mean, in case of Chernobyl nuclear power plant, for sure. And the way the film is trying to kind of reconcile this idea is what I'm interested right now. So, and another kind of way the social workers were integrated in the broader pictures. It's also like a quote from the same guy here, Pearson, across all four films, kind of representing this construction worker. Construction workers are happier than many others. They did not have to wait for decades after the first stake was nailed to see what the city would look like when it was finally built. And it's a distinction, of course, of this like construction workers, very like blurred and inconsistent, because it was the same people who like constructed the town or nuclear power plant and were part of this community. So they constructed, lived, and enjoyed like urban infrastructure, natural landscape and environment. So I'm doing it just for my own sake to be sane, because there's so much in it. Why not? It's like a perfect description of non-alienated labor, when you have results of your labor just like in front of you. It's very interesting kind of. Yeah, so they neither deprived in the project of their kind of activities. And what is the most important is the production process. It brings you joy in a way. So distinction between labor and leisure in these films, and like of course they operating within framework, they operating within like hardly exist. When you work and your leisure is your part of your work, and vice versa. And another name for this kind of non-alienated labor activity in the Soviet Union is called art. It was nurtured the idea that artist is a producer and producer is artist, like traces back to avant-garde and 20s. It's like one episode it's a very symptomatic. The way that aestheticization, you can see like the same guy decorates the crane with like flowers, which is symbol of beauty or whatever, and sends this to his like female counterparts on the top of the building. It's a very staged episode of war, but it's very symptomatic for me how this like social contradiction of this type of labor is being aestheticized to kind of conceal all like social problems we have with this. And it's like a reference to the people came from all republics to build all Soviet republics to this like Komsomol construction site. And they were from different republics, speaking sometimes different languages. And the way they again try to create the sense of community. So despite it being so different, we're still like one family, because what unites us is like construction project and like vision of bright Soviet future. And yeah, although they're also young, all these people like Komsomol members, they drop the average age of Pripyat town, which is like Chernobyl atomic town, to 26 years, like average. And despite of like constant decline in birth rate in the Soviet Union until 70s, Atomograd has been like portrayed as the epicenter of like Soviet baby boom. So if almost every other shot or frame, you can see kids in the frame just like wandering around, enjoying their life. And youth is very important again trope for kind of Soviet culture and ideology, because the idea was to convince viewers or us or consumers of this product that young people is the main agency of the communist society. It just was hardly true, because between like 1964 and 1982, the percentage of kind of new members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party declined from 37% to 16%. And by 1980, the average age of kind of average Communist Party member was like 70 plus. So they're trying to kind of make you believe that you young people is the agency of like force and future progress, while kind of this very gerontocratic rule is still there, and there's another kind of substitution of social kind of issue is this its own resolution. And to like summarize and to kind of conclude this, another aspect, so they were young, they were sometimes unpaid, sometimes paid, and they were unexperienced and usually unqualified. They were kind of involved to do like welding work, crane work, just like general labor. But this is very interesting how they kind of substitute again the lack of enthusiasm, like professional skills. It's kind of some just enthusiasm, creative solidarity, spirit of competitiveness. And it's a quote again from the film. There are two twin brothers and twin sisters, and the main narrative in the film, they found each other on the construction site, married, and created again this like familial kind of community, manifestation of this familial community. So from film to film, they deal not with like a lack of strategic planning, shortages of the material, which is a violation of the production code and norms, but what they do, they just like demonstrate creativity and inventiveness, which, I mean, it works nice when you need to mobilize people, but only if we ignore the fact that they're welding like a basis for a nuclear power plant reactor or anything like that. So yeah, just like I'm out of time. Sorry for this like hectic introduction to this topic. I mean, my further research, I'm interested in like environmental policies in Soviet Union and urban planning, like in more details. But for now, I think I'm done. Thank you.
Don't mind, I'd like to start with a question for you, Stas.
You have to. It's a labor type of activity.
So these films, how often were they shown? As far as, you know, what setting would you see them in? Were they in local theaters in towns, you know, across the USSR? And then also, after viewing one of these films, an individual who potentially want to move to one of these towns and become a part of this construction programs, how would they do so?
Yeah, it's an interesting question to kind of demonstrate how marginal and niche my my research is. It's a tricky one. So there's definitely a lack of data which I can work with analyzing like distribution like path of these films. So they are commissioned by a television studio and they were made in Russian, which means all union kind of broadcasting possibility or capacity. So they were made in Ukraine by Ukrainian television studio, but they were made in like universal language of the Soviet Union. So potential of the reach initially like included in production was wide. I'm trying to check why wide was this distribution. It's hard because I cannot go back and work with the archive right now at the moment. But I'm checking like newspapers and like TV programs. And I found several of these films were screened like constantly, maybe for a month, like months-long screening pool, both in local television in Ukraine and then like all union Russian kind of centered TV station. There are also cinema theaters dedicated specifically to non-fiction or documentary films. In Kiev, there are like several of them. Sometimes those films were the part of a larger kind of and programming pool. They were screened before feature films in theaters. Newsreels as well, yes. There are several ways to kind of be exposed to these films. I'm aware of kind of limited distribution of these films, but that not I'm interested right now. I'm just trying to kind of analyze the massive of works I have in front of me. Yeah, but it's really interesting and important question because like a lot of film scholars like analyze one film and no one saw that film, and then just like your life wasted and just like okay, did it wrong. Yeah, but that's my answer to your question. Like non-fiction films were partially marginalized and made not by big studio, usually commissioned by different ministries, like Ministry of Health, so like electricity or energy, like and commissioned the film was made, and then it was really hard to trace what's happened with the film after it was commissioned because it wasn't on the main theater like distribution chain.
Right?
Can you move this to slide on chapters and you can take the question on. Sorry.
Okay, I was actually, my first question actually requires the slides to move even forward. The slide with the dates for the films, for the movies? Yeah, this one. 70%. Okay, because I was wondering like whether you would be interested in tracing it even more like back in history, because this is very specific period. And also like the broader question, what I mean is like those 70s and 80s in the countries. I'm from Poland, so in the countries that were either in like a Soviet influence zone or were like a Ukraińska Radialna Republika Socjalistyczna, where they're like a part of USSR. It might be very different between those countries, and that would be very interesting, at least to me, like to show how for example, how different it looked in Belarus, in Ukraine, in other like Soviet republics or Soviet influenced countries. That would be very, very interesting. And the other question, the other part that would be very interesting to me is how those movies, which as you said are mostly like non-fiction, very for me they're very like familiar in style. Like I saw those types of movies not in my youth but in my like education. In Poland, looking at how movies looked back in the 70s, 80s, during like socialist times, I would be very interested in how those look in comparison to, I don't know, like Andrzej Tarkowski movies like Stalker or something like that, like very popular, at least in our cultural region movies, which also touch that topic, like this atomic zona type of themes. And is there like a huge difference? Is there like a small difference in the way you are showing the atomic infrastructure? Let's say it broadly.
Yeah, to comment on the kind of timeline of these films. They started to build Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1970. And timeline is very interesting in construction of nuclear power plant because there are different stages of production. So you have like the official ceremony when you just like pour the first cubometer of concrete or whatever, and it marks the construction site. Then you finish the kind of concrete building or edifices around. Then you have to kind of put reactors there. Then you have to launch physical reactor. And it's like the timeline is about like 7 years from construction site to, and then you have to connect it to the grid and start to produce electricity in industrial scale and kind of deliver this electricity. So this films in a way, the first reactor was commissioned of Chernobyl nuclear power plant was commissioned in 1977. So this kind of film that they use this as a core and they built around this timeline.
Yeah.
So and it's very narrow, I understand, but that's why I'm
Like to my other question, like I think also like movies like Stalker, which first came to I think it's like 78, something like
Yeah,
that. So it's like this exactly the same period, yeah.
yeah, there are like a lot of discussion about like because it's a part of stagnation culture and like Brezhnev and all that stuff. I can move. I mean, I'm interested in films about Ukrainian nuclear power plants.
Okay.
Chernobyl is the first one. They started late in the 70s. I'm kind of did some research on general like Soviet documentary films about nuclear project, be it like peaceful or military applications. And they kind of reflect or mirror this inconsistency in the nuclear power plant production itself. There are several films, a lot of films, actually, almost 9 films produced from 1954 to 1960 when they just started the project. And it's very important to launch its international appeal. And films are very important for the first like 1955 Geneva conference. They use film, and not only Soviet Union, United States, Canada, UK, they screen a lot of films as a theater. Like there was a theater program and there was like exhibition pool and you can use it at your kind of pavilion or whatever it's. Yeah, so films are very important, but like all Soviet Union film production about nuclear were less scarce and inconsistent. So they made one film about Obninsk nuclear power plant because it was the first one, and then they made another 2 films about two like nuclear power plants. That's why I mentioned that Chernobyl is the most prolific in a way. So there are more films produced by Ukrainian TV studios than any other film studios in Soviet republics. That's why I'm interested in this particular period. And there's some films to compare, but yeah, I'm aware of the films, but there are less of them. It's intriguing me because in part, as I mentioned, the project in the whole was kind of centered in Russia and all administrative decision made in Russia. There's a part of kind of Republican dignity or subjectivity or agency to produce your own power plant and to promote it within the Soviet Union and beyond the Soviet Union.
And actually, what you said at the end, that's actually one other thing that I wanted to say. I'm sure you are aware of that, but that's like one thing I always think about when I hear about any like Soviet related research would be to like avoid, I don't know if it's the same word in English, but like presentism, like the fallacy of like comparing current status of, for example, like state-of-the-art standards of construction of atomic plants with how it looked in like 60s, 70s. And for that, I think like a better comparison for that would be like how US atomic plants, atomic infrastructure was created during like 60s, 70s, and 80s, and to compare those two rather than comparing those standards with standards we have today, because they are completely different. And like it's not like USSR specific thing that they were different everywhere. And that they weren't better anywhere else. It's not like they were like really bad there and everywhere else we had like 2021st century safety regulations. It looked basically like that everywhere. It's not different here. It was like basically the same. And also like what you asked about, like about a bit like about those like moving people, organizing workers. Actually, it was very similar in other countries outside of USSR, like moving people, raising towns just to build like a power plant or something. For example, like in US in 1920s, 30s, they were building like whole cities, thousands of people from the ground up just to build like a factory or something.
A lot of Polish workers built like power plants in Western Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I was asked to.
I'm done, sorry.
Have some comments and they are a little bit scattered because they come from different places. So thinking as part of the Commons program, I think this is a super important presentation. I think that thinking about Utopia is super urgent in times where we see not just massive enclosure, but also how we are almost like, yeah, like we're seeing the theft of prefigurative politics. Like we are not even able to imagine something different because of the state of things. So I think studying utopias is super important. This is super relevant. Thank you for presenting. Another separate comment comes from more cultural studies kind of perspective that I think even if the movie was not watched, not even by one person, it is still super relevant to understand its production, how it speaks to the moment, the process of it, even if it was never released. So it's not a matter of numbers. It is, rethinking that idea of course, you know this because you're in the media school, but yeah, of reception and how reception is taken. And I think that you have super important work here with things that you mentioned. This is not simply about propaganda. This is about larger contradictions. This is, about producing. This is world making. Thinking about utopias is world making. And if it is not screened, I don't think it's that relevant to me. And the third comment was about how this is a super geographical project. And thinking about the contradictions of labor, the contradictions of nature. This is something that is very closely connected to geography. So I guess that I wanted to share that with you so that you think, maybe you can talk to people in the geography department. At least I'll be super happy to follow up. I'm thinking, of course, I just working on water and literature and how those things come together. And I have other ideas, other resources, but definitely Professor Andy Bruno, he does environmental history of Russia and has many, many ideas about this. I was thinking also if you were able to connect with SUS, which is the Center for Eurasian Studies. So all of those things that are already on campus that I think would be super, useful for your research. So it's more comments of, yay, keep doing the work. This is not small. This is relevant. I see where it fits in different, from different perspectives.
Very kind of antisocial in a way. It's my first exposure to. And I work with Andy. We discuss the project.
Good, so you already know.
Yeah.
Yes, I was worried that maybe you. And yes, again, geography, this is a very geographical kind of project. Even if you're not thinking about that, these are the kinds of conversations that are very present in the discipline.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting. I have a question, a factual question, maybe a little bit out of what you talked, but what happened with the film industry and this tendency of presenting the nuclear plants, the atom energy as peace, happiness, or beauty after Chernobyl blew up? This was 5 years before the falling down of the Soviet Union. So I don't know. I assume after Chernobyl blew up, they kind of changed this tendency, this concept of the utopia, or
Yeah, that's basically my dissertation. About it, what happened after. I'm kind of including this part because it was kind of overshadowed by post-Chernobyl dystopian consensus, and people knew nothing about all those films. That's why I see it as a kind of reintegrating it as like Chernobyl iconography in general. That's why I focus on that right now. What happened after, like from 1986, there are like 5 films made before Chernobyl, maybe not more, 10 different studios created. After Chernobyl happened, from 1986 to 1996, Ukrainian state studio and private enterprises produced or commissioned up to 40 films. It's like outburst of film production unprecedented for the Republic. So the same type of outbursts happened after the Second World War. And my second chapter, and I have like my own timeline and chronology of this film production. So as I kind of see it, from 1986 to 1989 in Ukraine, because Ukrainian communist leader Sherbitsky was kind of dismissed and fired, and perestroika and all those processes launched by Gorbachev actually happened in Ukraine, started to happen since 1989. So we're talking about perestroika as a general timeline of Soviet Union. It's very different in different Soviet republics. It feels different in Ukraine, in Armenia, in Georgia than in Russia. And the level of kind of democratic openness was also very different. So there are several films made. One of the most important film, Chernobyl Chronicles of the Hard Weeks. It became the Chernobyl film. It was distributed internationally, like several dozens of countries bought it for TV distribution. It kind of became the main representation of Chernobyl after Chernobyl happened, but it remained very Soviet film. And I'm interested in the kind of this utopian film because there is continuity in rhetorics and discourse between pre-Chernobyl and post-Chernobyl films, at least several years after Chernobyl. They share the same rhetorical devices and kind of space. They talk about war, victory, soldiers, duty, everything like that. So it's my second chapter. I'm comparing this film as what I call the vernacular disaster. In Pripyat, there was also an amateur film studio called Pripyat Film Existed. And they made several films just before the accident and immediately after the accident. So I'm very interested in kind of non-theatrical films as well, and kind of this very local produced material. And those materials were used by many films, Ukrainian and international, as just like a chronicle, so like archival footage, sometimes never credited properly. So this part was my research. Unfortunately, I still have the film digitized, but the whole collection was destroyed because it was stored near the facilities of Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And in 2022, Russian forces kind of invaded and destroyed this whole archive. So there is no traces. This is another dimension of kind of military peaceful. So there is no Pripyat film archive left, but I still have some materials digitized. So I want to compare kind of official response and vernacular response from below in a way. It's the third chapter is what happened after 1988 till 1991 when Ukraine became independent and Soviet Union collapsed. One of the most important and interesting to me, because the way the film were used as a part of environmental protest and broader anti-social agenda. So it was immediately from 1988, Chernobyl and kind of this whole nuclear project was framed as colonial in a sense. So there were like 13 out, I'm not remember exact number because there are different reactors type. It's like 13 out of, I don't know, 1/3 of reactors built in Ukraine. And if you compare it to density of population, it's a lot. A lot of reactors are built in Russia, but Russia is much bigger. So they start to kind of Ukrainian intellectuals, mostly parts of the literature union of writers union and cinematographic union was a part of this like social kind of protest, which turned into environmental protest. And there are many films kind of filming the protest and kind of all the mass rallies in Kyiv, for example, anti-nuclear or pro-like environmental agenda. And for some, there are scholars, and there is a scholar who calls this like eco-nationalism, the whole approach and the time period. And it's happened similar in Lithuania as well and in Belarus. So this is very important films that kind of document how social and environmental movement turn into political movement and lead in a way, I mean, we can argue to kind of question the authority of Soviet science, Soviet governance, just like Soviet state as a whole, and it collapsed in a way. And for many, Chernobyl was, especially in Eastern Bloc, Chernobyl was a kind of the symptom of, it was a local Berlin Wall before the Berlin Wall, and it signifies the deterioration of the system before it kind of Berlin Wall happened. And what happens after 1991 until 1996, because the law on cinematography changed in 1986 and the whole like infrastructure was reshaped after that. it's again another challenge they have to address. So Ukraine became independent, and they need nuclear power plants for electricity production. So they're a very bizarre way to again reconcile Chernobyl, but with Ukrainian independence and kind of agency and all this infrastructure. And they started to make these weird films. They call it eschatological melodrama about like very transhistorical, antisocial, not addressing. It's very similar to what happened like in Utopia films. They're not addressing like social issues at all. They stage like there one guy who made 9 films, and it's like for whom the bell tolls, Chernobyl and the apocalypse, and they frame Chernobyl not as like social conflict or anything related to social. When you have like Chernobyl liquidators, the guy who like clean up after the Chernobyl, and you have to pay them benefit. So they stage the whole Chernobyl event as a kind of in religious terms, like quasi like Christian fight against Christ and Satan, and the whole iconography. There's even Christian Orthodox icon commissioned by Russian church created with all this like liquidated dressed and as saints. So this again kind of moved away from try to kind of conceal the social issues, health issues, by this very weird melodrama structured films about like global bad and good and it's mainly because they're like Chernobyl is a wormwood and it worm was the part of the apocalypse, so they immediately started to interpret it as like this whole dramatic. Yeah, and the fourth part is about the first in for many years only one feature film about Chernobyl made in 1990, and it's interesting for me because it's a co-production between Ukraine and the United States, and it involves Dolby technology because there are no Dolby technology in the Soviet Union. The closest was Czechoslovakia back then, and Dolby technology allows you to distribute your film internationally because a lot of international film theaters were equipped with Dolby technology and sound. So there is Peter Almond, son of Gabriel Almond from Stanford, like scholar, came to Kiev. His father came to Kiev as the first Fulbright scholar to teach political science at Taras Shevchenko University. His son came with him. He was like a producer film, and he read the script and they created this co-production unit between Ukraine and the States, and then made sound and George Lucas Skywalker Ranch in California in 90. So the guys, sound designers who were in charge of like making Star Wars and Indiana Jones were kind of contributing to this particular historical piece. And I have this archive and I'm very interested. Yeah, so it was long answer to a very short question, but thanks. I feel it's such a relief to speak about those aloud. Sometimes I feel like I'm thanks. And you're out.
Titles are amazing. You will certainly know how to name a chapter.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you want to come back to Komsomol or?
Well, okay, two things. So the first thing was very interesting to see that the entire newsreel apparently were in Russian. I thought for Ukraine, at least they would be able to release the same motion picture with both Russian voice and Ukrainian voice, like dubbing or whatever, subtitles. They didn't do that.
Then, I mean, there was a very rare practice actually. So when the film was on the stage of production and they see, as I mentioned, distribution potential across the Soviet Union, they made it in Russia. It was very expensive to dub it and then redub it. There is one film like feature film from 61. Oh, what is the name? It's a famous one. I'm sure you know it. So it was made initially in Ukrainian. But then it was like so popular, they kind of redubbed it and destroyed Ukrainian versions, or only Russian versions survived. And we recently kind of found Ukrainian version about something about like Zaitsev. I don't remember. It's like, yeah. So the practice was just like no dubbing was a common practice within the Soviet Union. They were dubbing like Central Asian films because the language was kind of different, and it was really hard to. So my answer is that it was really inefficient in terms of production to do one film in two separate languages.
And then regarding the young Komsomol workers, I think, there is a saying, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So I think if you actually have it in your dissertation, probably would be very helpful to have some good references for it, maybe interviews with people or some documents of the period or whatever. I understand it may be not easy to get a hold of people anymore, more of the documents. But I think it would certainly be something your dissertation committee would be asking for.
Thank you. Yeah, again, I mean, I want to echo what Diana was saying earlier about the importance of this kind of work. But one thing, I mean, there's a lot happening in the dissertation, and I know that it's a dissertation level study, so it's like there should be a lot happening. But can we go back to this?
I was trying to predict your kind of, what do you want from me? I failed. What do you want?
What I'm thinking is that, like, here, for example, what is happening is that, like, it starts with a chapter that talks about film about the use of technology, right? So atomic technology, and then of course production of space within that, and production of society and ideologies and art and culture and everything, right? But by the time it reaches chapter 4, it seems like it's the technology that kind of taking the film technology itself taking the lead, like Dolby technology and internet, like how it is, the technology itself is producing the story, right? So it starts with a story about the technology to the end where it is like technology telling the story. So I don't know, like, how you kind of wrap up this everything into this amazing circle, like where technology becomes the story. I don't know if I'm kind of putting it across.
That sounds epic, yeah.
But it seems like it becomes, so for example, in chapter 1, it is more about the geography, about it's situated in a place. And in chapter 4, it's all about the film, right? A place in the film. So it becomes kind of, in a way, like a little bit disassociated with the actual place and the reconstruction of place in the film itself. So it starts with the place and ends up in the film.
Yeah, but there are also like a lot of reference to places. Co-production is kind of connection of two places.
Right.
There are like evidence how Ukrainian team went to like San Francisco in 1990, like buying bananas and Safeway, which is like never saw anything like that. So there are kind of, I try to kind of interwove like technology like everywhere, because I have like technology in my title.
Right.
And my committee members were very strict about like the technology.
Right.
But like the first chapter is more about large scale technological systems, like nuclear power plant is technology and reactors. I never talk about reactor. It's also very important because Chernobyl, it was only one power plant in Ukraine built with very specific type of MBNK reactor. And it was partially like domestic technology, which was also has the capacity to enrich plutonium for military application. That's why they never exported that type of reactor. So it's like I'm trying to be consistent. Sometimes it's hard, but I'm glad that you see something holistic.
Yeah, and like that co-production is so evident here. I so feel like reading your dissertation now.
We ran out of time.
Sorry, round of applause for Scott.
Yeah,